Imagine 10,000 men needing to sleep while an enemy castle looms above them. Archers ready, gates hiding cavalry that could charge any moment. One wrong decision, and everyone dies in their bedrolls. Yet commanders didn't lose sleep over this problem because they knew something about human psychology that most people today have completely forgotten. Here's the thing about medieval armies. They didn't just show up to a castle and immediately crash for the night. That would get them killed. After marching 10 to 15 miles through mud, forests, and whatever else medieval roads threw at them, soldiers arrived completely exhausted, legs burning, shoulders aching from carrying gear, every instinct screaming to just collapse. But experienced commanders? They said no, absolutely not. Not until basic defenses were up, and they weren't being cruel. They were keeping everyone alive. See, scouts had usually identified the siege site days earlier. They looked for flat ground, access to water, and timber nearby. The army knew exactly where they were headed, but knowing where to camp and actually being safe there are two very different things. That first night was pure chaos waiting to happen. Castle defenders weren't stupid. They watched the exhausted army stumble into position, and they saw opportunity. Surprise sorties, quick cavalry charges bursting from the gates, could scatter unprepared troops before anyone organized properly. Edward III learned this the hard way at Calais in 1346. His army lost over 40 men to a nighttime attack before their camp was even established. 40 soldiers dead. Not in glorious battle, in their bedrolls. So that first night, nobody really slept, not properly. Soldiers rotated through watches with weapons in hand and armor still buckled. Try sleeping comfortably in chainmail. I'll wait. Now, here's a detail that sounds made up but isn't. Experienced commanders actually positioned their loudest snorers toward the center of camp. Why? So perimeter guards could hear approaching threats instead of what sounded like a dying ox with respiratory issues. But setting up camp was just the beginning. Where soldiers actually slept within that camp, that was an entirely different military decision. Camp layout wasn't random. Every sleeping position carried meaning, and getting it wrong could get you killed or humiliated. Sometimes both. Here's how it worked. Nobles and commanders slept closest to the castle walls. Sounds insane, right? Why would the important people sleep in the most dangerous spot? Simple. Leadership meant showing courage. A lord who positioned himself safely behind his men would lose respect faster than he'd lose a chess match to a 5-year-old. Medieval politics ran on reputation, and reputation demanded visible bravery. Common soldiers arranged themselves by unit. Groups of 8 to 12 men stuck together because they shared cooking pots, supplies, and basically everything else. These weren't random assignments. These were the guys watching your back. You slept next to the people you'd been marching with for weeks. Now here's where medieval commanders got clever. The camp formed a rough crescent around the castle, but not a complete circle. They left gaps, deliberate weak points. And those gaps, pure trap. Defenders launching sorties would naturally aim for the easy spots where ambush parties waited with extremely unfriendly intentions. Latrine placement mattered more than most people realize. Downwind, downhill. Always. Armies that ignored this basic rule learned about dysentery the hard way. And dysentery killed more medieval soldiers than swords ever did. Way more romantic to die in battle. Way more common to die from bad camp sanitation. The Siege of Acre in 1189, that camp held roughly 100,000 people. Not just soldiers, families, merchants, craftsmen, an entire mobile city that needed organized sleeping arrangements or chaos would follow, but finding your spot in camp was only half the battle. What you actually slept on, that determined whether you woke up functional or feeling like death itself. Most common soldiers slept on dirt. That's it. No mattress, no cushion, just cold ground and whatever you wore that day. Your cloak did double duty, mattress underneath, blanket on top. One piece of wool between you and hypothermia. Luxury travel accommodations? Not exactly. Straw changed everything. Foraging parties raided nearby farms specifically for it, and soldiers stuffed whatever they found into cloth sacks. These crude mattresses weren't comfortable by any modern standard, but compared to sleeping directly on frozen mud, absolute heaven. Here's something nobody tells you. Knights and nobles, they brought actual beds, portable wooden frames that servants assembled each night. While common soldiers shivered on the ground, some lord 20 feet away slept elevated on proper bedding. Medieval inequality wasn't subtle. But everyone shared one problem: bugs, fleas, lice, rats. Within a week of any prolonged siege, every single person in camp was infested. Didn't matter if you were a peasant conscript or the Earl of wherever. The tiny vampires didn't check your family tree before biting. Experienced soldiers developed tricks. They dig shallow depressions shaped like their bodies. Sounds primitive because it was. But these little holes trapped body heat and blocked wind. The difference between uncomfortable sleep and dangerous sleep. And here's the old campaigner wisdom that actually saved lives. Always position your feet toward the fire. Yes, you might singe your toes, but burnt toes heal. Frostbite in an era without antibiotics? That could mean amputation or death. I've camped in cold weather exactly once. One night, modern sleeping bag, inflatable pad, the works. Still woke up sore and grumpy. These men did it for months straight with basically nothing. Of course, having something over your head helped enormously, and what medieval soldiers used for shelter? Way more creative than you'd expect. Now let's talk about what went over their heads, because sleeping arrangements get a lot better when rain isn't hitting your face. Here's the surprise. Most common soldiers didn't own tents, not even cheap ones. Instead, they shared large canvas sheets propped up by their own spears. 6 to 10 guys crammed underneath something that looked like a deflated sail held up by pointy sticks. Cozy? Absolutely not. Functional? Barely. But it kept the worst weather off. Usually. Nobles? Completely different story. Their pavilions required multiple wagons just to transport. Some of these elaborate setups included separate sleeping chambers, reception areas for visitors, and enough fabric to clothe a small village. One lord's tent might use more canvas than an entire infantry company shared. When sieges dragged past a few weeks, something interesting happened. Soldiers became construction workers. They stripped nearby forests and built actual wooden huts, semi-permanent structures with walls, roofs, and something resembling doors. The French siege camp at Rouen in 1418 became so developed it had wooden houses, taverns, and a makeshift church. A church. At a military siege. Medieval soldiers apparently needed somewhere to pray before going back to starving people out. Want to know someone's importance without asking? Just look at their tent. Pennants flying overhead meant nobility. Plain canvas with no flags meant nobody cared who you were. The medieval army was basically a fabric-based hierarchy chart. And that waterproofing? They rubbed animal fat or beeswax into the canvas. Effective, sure. But the smell? Rancid. Imagine sleeping under something that smells like a butcher shop left out in summer heat. For months. Still, bad smell beats drowning in your sleep. Of course, even the best shelter meant nothing without guards watching for danger. And the medieval watch system? Way more brutal than you'd think. Falling asleep on guard duty could get you executed. Not exaggerating. Most medieval armies had death as the official punishment for dozing sentries. Though honestly, enforcement got flexible when commanders needed every warm body they could get. The night split into shifts. 3 or 4 watches, roughly 3 hours each. Every soldier rotated through guard duty across the siege's duration. Nobody escaped it, not even if you'd spent all day digging trenches or hauling supplies. Here's where it gets clever. Guards didn't just stand around hoping to spot trouble. They used communication systems that would make spy movies jealous. Owl hoots, specific whistle patterns, code words that changed every single night. Why the constant changes? Because castle defenders sometimes sent infiltrators dressed as friendly soldiers. Yesterday's password could get you killed today. Sunset brought a trumpet blast that meant business. Dim your fires. Stop wandering around. The camp goes quiet. Sentries positioned themselves 50 to 100 yards apart along the entire perimeter, close enough to shout warnings to each other, far enough apart that one lucky arrow couldn't eliminate multiple guards. Smart spacing, actually. And the weird part? Soldiers had preferences about which watch they pulled. The middle watch, roughly midnight to 3 in the morning, was actually popular among veterans. Why? Because waking up from deep sleep for the first watch felt absolutely miserable. Staying up late was easier than getting dragged out of dreamland. The first watch meant fighting your body's desperate need for sleep. The last watch meant shivering through the coldest hours before dawn. The middle watch? You'd already been awake and you finished with time to sleep before morning duties. Medieval soldiers optimized their misery. Respect that. But staying awake meant burning energy. And burning energy meant needing food. Lots of it. Feeding an army was a logistical nightmare that would make modern supply chain managers weep. Here's the math. 10,000 soldiers needed roughly 20,000 pounds of grain daily, plus 5,000 gallons of water every single day, for months. Now you understand why siege commanders had gray hair. The main meal happened at dusk. Smart timing. Soldiers ate before sleeping because digestion actually generates body heat. A full stomach meant a warmer night. Medieval commanders didn't know the science, but they knew what worked. Dinner was usually pottage. Thick, heavy, boring. Grain, beans, whatever vegetables hadn't rotted, and meat if the foragers got lucky. Glamorous? Absolutely not. Filling? That was the entire point. And those cooking fires? They pulled double duty. After the pots emptied, soldiers arranged themselves in circles around the dying embers. Free heating. Men positioned themselves like spokes on a wheel, feet toward the warmth, heads outward. Burnt toes beat frozen ones. Alcohol created interesting problems. Wine and ale were actually safer than most water sources. Parasites couldn't survive in booze, but drunk sentries became every commander's headache. The balance between hydration and discipline was constant. Then there's the supply cart situation. Wagons often arrived at night to avoid daytime attacks. Guess who had to unload them? Exhausted soldiers who'd just fallen asleep. Commanders refused to leave vulnerable supplies sitting until dawn, so men dragged themselves up, unloaded grain sacks, then collapsed back onto their bedrolls. Hungry soldiers became angry soldiers. Chroniclers wrote about this constantly. Food shortages caused more mutinies than enemy attacks ever did. A well-fed army slept soundly. An army with empty stomachs. They plotted rebellion in their tents. Speaking of things that attacked sleeping soldiers, arrows weren't the only danger falling from above. Castle defenders weren't just sitting around at night feeling sorry for themselves. They were busy turning the siege camp into a shooting gallery. Flaming arrows. That was the nightmare. Defenders aimed for the glow of campfires, knowing exactly where sleeping soldiers clustered. One well-placed shot into dry canvas, and suddenly you've got a tent full of screaming men. Pleasant dreams indeed. Smart soldiers figured this out fast. They built gabions. These were basically giant wicker baskets stuffed with dirt, arranged in walls around sleeping areas. Not glamorous, not comfortable. But arrows hit dirt instead of faces. Good trade. Here's where it gets genuinely terrifying. Trebuchets. These massive catapults could hurl rocks weighing hundreds of pounds. Now, firing them accurately at night was nearly impossible. But accuracy wasn't really the point. A boulder crashing through your tent at 2 a.m. created panic that spread like wildfire. Men trampled each other, trying to escape rocks they couldn't even see coming. The solution? Trenches. Soldiers within about 250 yards of the walls learned to sleep below ground level. Dig a shallow ditch, curl up inside, and arrows sailing overhead pass right by. Uncomfortable? Absolutely. Better than becoming a pincushion? Also, absolutely. The 1216 siege of Dover took creativity to new levels. French troops didn't waste arrows. They rolled boulders downhill into the English camp. Gravity did the killing. Soldiers sleeping in tents never heard it coming. Experienced commanders positioned themselves just beyond trebuchet range, roughly 300 to 400 yards from the walls, close enough to maintain authority, far enough to actually survive the night. But arrows and rocks weren't even the deadliest threat soldiers faced while sleeping. Something invisible killed far more men, and it started in the most unexpected places. Disease, the silent killer nobody saw coming. Arrows got the glory. Trebuchets got the fear. But tiny organisms invisible to medieval eyes, they did the real damage. And here's the cruel twist. They attacked while soldiers slept. Dysentery was the big one. Soldiers called it the bloody flux, which tells you everything you need to know about the symptoms. One infected man sharing a latrine with hundreds of others meant the whole camp got sick within days. Men went to sleep feeling fine, woke up unable to stand, dead by the following week. Typhus spread through lice. Remember those infestations we mentioned earlier? Every soldier scratching himself at night was basically giving disease a free highway into his bloodstream. The fever came first, then delirium, then nothing. The numbers are genuinely shocking. Medieval armies lost roughly 10 to 20% of their strength to sickness during sieges lasting longer than 2 months. That's not a rounding error. That's 1 in 5 men dying without ever seeing an enemy sword. Philip II of France learned this the hard way at Chateau Gaillard. His camp epidemic killed more soldiers than the entire English garrison he was trying to defeat. Imagine winning the siege but losing the war against invisible enemies. Medieval doctors blamed bad night air. They called it miasma theory. Soldiers actually started covering their faces while sleeping, thinking the darkness itself carried poison. Completely wrong reasoning. Accidentally helpful results. Some airborne transmission probably got blocked by those face coverings. Blind luck disguised as medical wisdom. Sick men got moved to isolated areas downwind from camp. Made sense. Except by the time symptoms showed up, they'd already infected everyone they'd been sleeping next to. But disease wasn't the only thing that killed men slowly. Winter brought something worse. Winter was the great equalizer. It didn't care about your rank. Most commanders avoided winter sieges entirely, not out of mercy for their enemies, out of math. Freezing temperatures killed soldiers faster than starvation weakened the people hiding behind castle walls. Why lose your army to weather when you could just wait until spring? But sometimes politics didn't allow waiting, and that meant sleeping in conditions that would make modern campers file lawsuits. Body heat became currency. Soldiers slept in tight clusters of 4 to 6 men, piling every cloak and blanket they owned into shared cocoons. Personal space? Gone. Dignity? Frozen solid somewhere around November. But survival trumped comfort every single time. Here's what nobody tells you about medieval winter camping. Fire wasn't optional anymore. It was mandatory medical equipment. Men slept so close to flames that burn injuries became almost as common as frostbite. Singed eyebrows were a badge of honor. Meant you'd survived another night. Edward III knew what he was doing at Calais. That siege stretched from September 1346 into the following summer. He shipped prefabricated wooden huts across the English Channel because he understood something crucial. Canvas tents weren't going to cut it. His soldiers needed actual walls. The insulation tricks were clever, though. Soldiers stuffed their clothing with straw, dried leaves, anything that trapped air. Modern survival experts still recommend this technique. 700 years later, and we haven't improved on shove plants in your shirt. Morning brought a grim ritual, checking on the men who'd stopped shivering during the night. Shivering means your body's still fighting. When it stops, so is everything else. Cold nights were brutal, but the psychological toll of endless siege weeks, that broke men in different ways entirely. Weeks of terrible sleep changed men, not just tired them, changed them. By month 2, discipline started crumbling. Guards dozed during shifts they'd have stayed sharp for in week 1. Men wandered around camp at random hours, their internal clocks completely shattered. I've pulled 2 all-nighters in a row and felt destroyed. These guys did it for 60 nights straight while people occasionally shot arrows at them. But here's what's fascinating. The final nights before a planned assault? Nobody slept anyway. Soldiers spent those hours sharpening weapons obsessively, confessing sins to priests, writing letters home that might be their last. The guy who'd been sleeping 12 hours a day suddenly couldn't close his eyes for 5 minutes, and defenders noticed. Increased nighttime activity in the siege camp was basically a neon sign screaming, "Attack coming soon." Smart castle commanders watched for it. Extra torch movement, more noise than usual, the smell of cooking fires burning longer as soldiers ate what might be their final meal. When walls finally cracked open, something strange happened. Men who'd been stumbling around like zombies for weeks suddenly found energy reserves they didn't know existed. Adrenaline is one heck of a drug, always has been. The sweetest irony? Successful besiegers finally got to sleep inside the castle they'd surrounded for months. Actual stone walls, real roofs, beds that didn't involve dirt and insects. The average medieval siege lasted 1 to 2 months, 30 to 60 nights of miserable, dangerous outdoor sleep before someone either surrendered or got conquered. Modern camping trips last a weekend, and we complain about the accommodations. These men endured conditions that would break most of us. They did it because they had no choice, and somehow they kept fighting.